Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the final session of the inaugural Cliveden Literary Festival. We do hope that you've enjoyed this weekend, found it intellectually stimulating. If you have, please tell your friends, and most importantly, please do buy tickets for next year. Thank you very much indeed.
Am I on? Can you hear me? No. Yes. Thank you all for coming this last session. I'll try and get it over and done with so you can get home on the motorway before the traffic builds up. We're here to discuss topsy-turvy politics and a look at Brexit and what's nexit. I did not write that myself, so I would like to disassociate myself from that. And our panel is quite topsy-turvy, I'd say. And I'm going to get them all to introduce themselves so that I don't make any mistakes. There's only one person I haven't met. It was this fellow at the end here, who's a late addition. So I think we'll start with him.
My name is Michael Gove, and I'm the Environment Secretary.
I'm Anne McElvoy. I'm Senior Editor at The Economist. I make some programmes for the BBC, and perhaps most importantly, I am making the Cliveden Festival podcast.
My name's Kwasi Kwarteng. I'm the MP for Spelthorne, which is just about 6 miles down the road, down the Thames. And I'm also a historian. And one of my books is here.
Available in the bookshop.
I'm taking a leaf from Andrew Roberts' book, who's very good at pointing out books which are on sale. So I'm very pleased to announce that.
I'm Sarah Vine. I work for the Daily Mail. And I'm going to be sort of trying to stop these people from getting into a fight.
I'm Stephen Pollard. I'm editor of the Jewish Chronicle, and I feel something of a fraud being here in that I discovered on June the 8th that everything I thought I knew about politics was completely wrong. And I know nothing about politics, so I don't know why I'm here, really.
Good afternoon. I'm Wegg-Prosse. I run a political risk consultancy, but I think I'm here because of my time working for the Labour Party when it was electable. I spent a number of years working in Downing Street and in another government departments. It's a delight to be back at Cliveden. The last time I was here, Michael, was for your stag do.
Oh, great disclosure.
That's great.
Which shows you how things have changed.
You earned your applause. Say no more.
Apparently there are some photographs.
Very good.
Well, I think the thing is no one knows anything about politics anymore because it's all gone so mad. But I thought we might start with Anne. And I think the place we might begin is I mean, topsy-turvy politics doesn't just apply to this country. Everywhere seems to have gone completely mad. I mean, we've got Spain's going a bit mad. The Austrians are about to elect a Nazi. Am I allowed to say Nazi?
They're always about to elect.
Okay, well, they seem to be doing it. The Americans have obviously gone mad. Who else has gone mad? Well, the French, they've got... I mean, everything is completely not as you would expect it to be. Anne has made some very good radio programmes on the subject, so I thought I might start by asking Anne, what is going on?
Well, I think that's a very good sweep there, Sarah, of examples. And, as you say, you can range very broadly. The only thing I would perhaps question a bit, and it's very much a response of thoughtful people about politics, I'm sure the room is full, to say everything's gone mad. Well, it's only gone mad if you expect things to remain largely the same. And history, and we've got a whole festival full of historians here who've written over the centuries, about the centuries, they're not that old, but they've written about the centuries on this. It is actually quite rare to have the periods of stability that we've seen since the end of the Second World War. The Cold War, which was a kind of an uncomfortable but also sort of guaranteed a kind of stability in that it sort of nailed colours to masts, and you tended not to move too much out of your comfort zone because you thought the other side might go, even more bonkers, a nuke you. So it is actually quite unusual, I think, in the historical sweep to have that. That said, I take your point. Those of us, as Stephen reflected it very well, who said, look, we thought we knew how politics worked. We thought you got a sort of small shift to the Lib Dems in here, and you got a bit of a tweak to the Conservatives, suddenly have found places in play that we never thought were going to vote a certain way. We found countries, America first among them, electing a president we probably didn't think came from a kind of presidential stripe, and I think Michael reflected on that in his earlier talk. The only reason I suppose the call for calm comes at the point where I spent a lot of time about, I suppose, what you could call the liberal elites. And one thing I'm almost getting a bit fed up with is how shocked everyone is, like permanently shocked about things which can change, can be very disruptive, can be very challenging. But, sad face, I'm so shocked, it's so frightening, is perhaps a response that I'd like to question. I don't think it's good enough. I think we're going to have to do better. And
also sort of incapacitated by confusion. I think for the Labour Party particularly, or the people I would consider to be on the centre of the Labour Party, the ones who are not mad Corbynistas. I mean, they don't seem to have any response, do they? They don't seem to be able to they don't know what to do. They're paralysed.
Well, they've tried and failed. So you saw the Labour Party, the summer of 2016, try and reassert control and failed completely. Corbyn ran an incredibly effective campaign, his second campaign in 12 months to become leader. And then you saw it last June, and I agree with Stephen. Many of the views that I had about kind of what it takes to win in politics were certainly challenged by the general election. But I think that what you'll see is I think that Corbyn will indeed become Prime Minister probably in the next 24 months. And then I think you'll see the Labour Party probably having to respond in a not dissimilar way to the way that the French responded when Mitterrand first became president, where you will basically have a kind of pushback against a perfectly admirable but ultimately unsuccessful Labour government. And that may well be, that probably in my view is the time when it will start to right itself. But I think that the Labour Party is set on a very clear course, and I think it will be very difficult to shake it off it, certainly until the next election.
And Kwasi, do you think Corbyn's going to get in?
Well, you'll be surprised to learn that I don't agree with his. And of course, all the pundits who said that Brexit wasn't going to happen and that Theresa May would get a stonking great majority are now saying, some of them, that Labour will get a majority or a government next time. And actually, I think what we've learned is that most of these predictions are false. So I don't think it's at all inevitable that he'll get through. I just wanted to pick up on some of the things that Anne has said. And we haven't actually used the dreaded P word, which is populism. And I was thinking about populism, and it seems to me that populism is a function of two things. One, someone that you don't like winning an election. And really, the second thing is you have got no response to them, so you just say it's populism. It's like a sort of catch-all swear word, term of abuse. And actually, and what I find very bizarre is that, and I was reading up about populism, is that populism generally only exists in democracies. And that's because people vote. So the populace votes. And I remember one Tory MP, we were talking about some leadership contest many years ago, before I was in the House. And they said, well, of course, you do realise it's not a popularity contest. And I said, no, that's exactly what it is. So, populism as a kind of catch-all phrase, I think, is devoid of real analytical content.
I think that's interesting, but I think there's another word that begins with a P that we should be discussing, and that's polarisation. Because politics seems to be becoming more and more polarised. Steve?
But I just want to come back to one thing that Kwasi said. But it isn't a popularity contest, otherwise Theresa May wouldn't be Prime Minister. I mean, she was hardly the most popular woman in the Conservative Party.
She was marginally more popular than Jeremy Corbyn.
Well, she was the victim, she was the beneficiary of some amazing circumstances when she became Prime Minister.
Yes,
but that leads me on to the worry that I have. I suspect that Ben's analysis is right, although I think we should stop making, I don't want to make predictions, it's what I worry about rather than what I predict will happen. And my worry is that the reason that I think Jeremy Corbyn will become Prime Minister, I'm not so much worried by Jeremy Corbyn, I'm much more worried by the people around him behind the scenes and the likes of John McDonnell and some of his advisors, who are hardcore Trotskyites and revolutionaries, the likes of which have never been anywhere near the levers of power in our country and were nothing like. I mean, Mitterrand was a social democrat. He was a socialist, but he was within the parameters of European social democracy. These people are not. And the worry that I have is that the Conservative Party, as it is at the moment, he appears not to be, I'm just talking in terms of the evidence of an outsider looking at it objectively, appears not to have the least idea how to counter that. I mean, not the first clue. And what is it going to take to give them that first clue? And we're in a strange circumstance where I exempt two Tory MPs on the panel today, but most Tory MPs. Well, no, I was going to say no, but
You don't have to. I mean, we can have it.
most Tories that I speak to are as one in realising that, of course, Theresa May is not the right person to be Prime Minister at the moment, but they're also as one in recognising, as I think is the case, that now is absolutely not the time to have a leadership coup and change Prime Minister. So you're in the bizarre circumstances where there is the biggest threat of all, a huge threat to the country in terms of the possibility of a Corbyn government. There is a Conservative Party that recognises that something must be done, but that knows that it can't do anything, but doesn't even know if it could do anything, what that thing should be, which is what one might call a mess.
Well, they're just paralysed. They just don't know. They're both frightened and confused. But I think that's part of why you get this polarisation, because the reason that the Labour, I mean, we were talking earlier about Corbyn and why he's done so well, and you had some very interesting thoughts on this, and I think it's to do with the fact that the Tories currently don't really have the right tools, whereas Labour clearly do.
Well, you've got to remember that Corbyn didn't come out of nowhere. Corbyn came out of 30 years of organisation and campaigning, from the remnants of the militant campaign in the mid-1980s, when they were forced out of the Labour Party. They then basically went into a series of what we would once call fringe movements. Ho ho, those fringe movements have essentially come back and taken over the Labour Party. And they've gone through a range of NGO campaigns, certainly Stop the War, and a number of other, as I say, what we would once have viewed as marginal groups. And thanks to extraordinary circumstances, as Stephen describes, an incredibly efficient and effective use of technology, incredibly well organised and disciplined, they have taken advantage of this perfect storm to take the commanding heights of the Labour Party. And I don't think the Tory party really get that. They think that because Corbyn has a beard and doesn't look good and is a sort of a bit of an old lefty, that they think that people will see through him. What they fail to understand is there is a truly remarkable on-the-ground organisation sitting beneath him. If you look at, for example, the work of Momentum, which is this group that originally got him to office and then played a significant role in the general election, you look at the money that they spent on Facebook, which was essentially zero, and you look at the shares that their videos had, tens of millions of views for these videos, which were incredibly effective campaigning tools against what the Tories were saying. And the Tories at the moment have simply no answer.
I mean, the Tories did spend a lot of money on Facebook and didn't really get them anywhere, did it? I mean, they did invest a lot of money.
Well, that I think is just a very quick one.
Because they're doing the wrong stuff.
Shall I let Michael? It's just the wrong model
Yes.
to say we spent money marketing a brand, which is, for young people, I have to, break it gently. The Conservative Party is not always a very easy brand if you're a hipster. It's not like absolutely the route to super popularity and better dating. So you've got to do something that seems to come upwards. Ben Wegg-Prosse's description is absolutely right, but the feel of that, I made a documentary partly talking to Momentum about what they'd done, was that this was the content that people wanted to make themselves. Yes, it was shaped by everything you described, but that's how it felt. And frankly, getting a bunch of slick marketeers to pump out Tory messages on Facebook was never going to work.
Michael, if I may... Oh, sorry.
No, sure.
No,
got you.
No, I'm going to be. I'll try to be a little bit counterintuitive. I'll try. Actually, Britain's an outlier in one respect. It's an outlier, actually, in the stability of our politics and the success of a mainstream centre-right party. If you look across Europe and across the developed world, you have fragmentation of politics. The first thing to bear in mind is that traditional parties of the centre-left, traditional social democratic parties, are getting whacked everywhere. Mm-hmm. So PASOK in Greece is taken over by Syriza, the Socialist Party in Spain, fractured, Podemos takes over. In the Netherlands, Green Labour, significantly to the left of the traditional Labour Party, overtakes them. Essentially, the model of social democratic politics that had been so successful in the West from 1948 onwards, kaput. And instead, you've had a variety, exactly as Ben mentions, of activist-based and networked organisations on the left overtaking them. And then on the centre-right, you've also had fracture as well. So you've had, most notably in Germany recently, the first time since 1948 when you've had a party to the right of the CDU-CSU in the Bundestag, and you've also had in Spain and in Ireland centre-right parties, Fine Gael and the PP, who are minority governments as well. Now, set against that, Theresa May got 42% of the vote, the highest share of the vote that any Conservative has had, with the exception of John Major, since 1983, and we don't have, there may be supporters of them here, we don't have UKIP MPs in Parliament. We have a successful centre-right party that comprehends within its tent everyone from Ken Clarke to Bill Cash.
To you.
To me. That's the most amazing thing. Well, so my argument is, in a way, people say, Brexit. As a result of Brexit, certain bad things have entered the political bloodstream. Well, I would refute that, perhaps unsurprisingly, since I argued for it. And I would say, as a result of Brexit, certain bad things were purged from the political bloodstream. And we now have a viable centre-right party, which is a broad coalition, which is in government and has the support of 42% of people, and represents everyone from the Surrey residents of Spelthorne and Surrey Heath to the people of Bamford Buchan in Scotland and Mansfield in Nottinghamshire. So my argument is that the topsy-turviness of our times is a global and in particular a Western phenomenon, and to an extent Britain is better insulated against it than many other countries.
But I mean, the reason for that isn't some sort of magic about British people or the British electorate. I mean, the simple answer, I would say, is first past the post. I mean, if we didn't have a first past the post system, and this is a pretty nightmarish concept for me, I don't know whether Ben would agree, but I think Tony Blair would probably be in government now if we had a proportional system. He'd have set up a centre party. They would have got 20% of the vote, and they could easily be in a coalition where he would get, one of a big ministry. So I think first past the post has a lot to commend it, actually.
I think
that I understand what Kwasi's saying. However, one of the merits of first past the post, we were always told, was that it led to strong and stable governments. The current minority government is relying on the support of the DUP for their mandate, not the most strong and stable setup possible. The 2010 Parliament was a coalition between the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives, which led to, thanks in part to the unpopularity of that coalition within the Conservative Party, led to pressure being put on David Cameron to call a referendum that he probably shouldn't have called to secure an outcome that he didn't want, that led to him losing his job. And so if we live in these times when first past the post is meant to give us strong and stable governments, you've got an incredibly weak and floppy government at the moment. And admittedly, you had a slightly stronger and stable government in 2010, but thanks to the consequences of the coalition, in part led to the lunacy of Brexit. So I'm not quite sure I buy your strong and stable argument, Kwasi.
No, it wasn't a strong and stable. I was making a specific argument about barriers to entry for new parties.
Everyone wants to applaud Ben.
And actually, I don't think. Sorry, just to go back on the Brexit point. We're not here to discuss Brexit, but I think even if Cameron hadn't given a referendum, this issue wasn't going to go away, and it really hasn't gone away. It was always something that was there, and I just wanted to say that.
Sure, but we all, some people want the death penalty. There are plenty of issues that are never going to go away. The consequences of this.
I mean, I think the point of the referendum was they were sort of hoping they would put the issue to bed, and instead of which, it just made it a lot worse. And I think there were lots of mistakes made in the way it was all handled. Sorry, Michael, but you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I'm just going to. Brexiteers at the moment have been characterised by some as Marxists, on the basis that the theory is perfect. It's just that the implementation is flawed. I would reject that, but I'm a Marxist in another way, in that I do believe that politics is downstream of economics and of culture. And I think one of the things about the whole West, not just in Britain, is that for the last nearly 10 years, the overwhelming majority of people have scarcely seen their standard of living improve as a result of all sorts of things that have happened in consequence of the economic crash. And that's true across the Western world. And I think that's one of the things that has contributed to discontent with established parties and established ways of organising government and politics. And the other thing with culture as well is that the failure, as perceived, of traditional politicians, traditional central bank governors, traditional corporate captains to deliver the prosperity, which they said was going to be guaranteed because they knew how things should be run and everyone should relax because they were in charge. That has led to a culture of disdain and contempt on both left and right, and that's what's created the situation that we have. And I think it's important to stress broadly across the West at the moment that relatively flat real wages and a sense of growing disdain towards elites, for want of a better word, though I know it's a word that's freighted with all sorts of double meanings, have contributed. And I think it's important in Britain that we don't get hung up, important as the decisions are that our government has to make in the course of the next couple of years, in thinking that we're somehow unique or exceptional. I think that we have some strengths that other countries don't have. We also face some challenges that they don't have. But it's right to look at this in the context of everything that's happening across the West.
Anne.
Well, yes, but if politics is downstream, as you say, from economics and culture, then you better be careful that what you do doesn't make the economics worse and the culture worse. And I think that is the risk that is being run. But it is one thing to say in that kind of drawing room where populism is just, people who win elections I don't agree with. And there is an element of that. We often describe things as populist or even popular that we kind of disdain, that are something of a threat to us. But there is a nasty populism, and let's not ignore the fact that those edges exist. There is often an undercurrent, and in most societies have some undercurrent in their politics, which, if not constrained or in a balance, one reason I agree with the points about the Labour Party is I think if you get rid of that commitment to parliamentary democracy, in that case, you're in dangerous territory. But in Brexit, you're in dangerous territory because the economics and the culture that you want to get better off the back of it, it is not, I think, yet absolutely clear or credible that the economy gets better as a result and answers your question about real-term wages stagnation. And nor is it yet clear to me, and I'm really not a Ramona by instinct, I've got quite a sort of a sceptical core to my argument, but I probably wouldn't have gone the way that you guys went about it, because I think the culture is more likely to be divided off the back of it than it was to be united, and I don't know how you put that back together again.
The thing that I was thinking about was the fact that I don't think a lot of this is necessarily rational. I don't think people are. When I talk about people, I mean voters. I think they just feel a bit irritated with all these people who've been running everything for such a long time, and I think it started with the banks and the bankers and all of that, and I think it's just sort of got worse and worse and worse, and they see themselves just never ever having any skin in the game. And I think what they're basically, some of them were just doing is just saying, for God's sake, listen to us. And of course, the problem with doing that is that, sometimes, you actually go a little bit further than you might want to do. And that seems to me what happened, particularly in America and also with the Labour Party. But I think there's another factor here that we haven't talked about, which is social media, which is a completely, really relatively new phenomenon on the scale that it currently is. And I think it's a total game changer. What's your view?
I think, I'll come to that in a second. I agree with you, it's a total game changer. Just want very briefly just come back to the Brexit thing. There is an undercurrent to this discussion. There's an undercurrent to pretty much every discussion you hear about Brexit, that it was some sort of coup engineered by a small number of fanatical Brexiteers who have taken control of the government somehow. The fact is that more people voted to leave the European Union than have voted for anything that has ever been put up in our country's history. 52% of the electorate voted for Brexit, and they're not all lunatic xenophobes who want nothing to do with the rest of Europe. And it is precisely this kind of sneering contempt for the 52% majority that has led us, in a way, down this path where politics is held.
This is what happened to Hillary Clinton in America. She had this. This is why her campaign went so badly wrong. I think was because she just every time anyone said, "Oh, I might vote for Trump," it was just, "Well, you're obviously a cretin."
Yes.
And you can't say that to people because they're not cretins. They are people and they have views and they have as much right as anyone else to have a view. And it was this idea that only that she knew everything. It was just this thing of being bossed around by people who think they're entitled to it. And I think a lot of people really railed against that.
But having done my bit of populism on Brexit, to answer your point about social media, now, I look at it, I mean, there are all kinds of broad issues you can talk about with social media, but I focus it on it professionally with a very narrow, limited view of it, which is the anti-Semitism that one sees on social media. And I wrestle all the time with one big question, which I don't know what the answer is, I got my idea, but is social media revealing something that has always been there? And this applies beyond anti-Semitism as well, a sort of virulence and a poison and a nasty way of conducting yourself. Is it something that has always been there, but has never had the opportunity to manifest itself and has never been given voice because people didn't have that opportunity? Or has social media become a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy? Has it led to this kind of politics? I don't know what the answer is. My view is probably the former. If you think about the anti-Semitism that is revealed amongst a lot of Corbynites, I find it hard to believe that suddenly these people have suddenly started writing and thinking awful things about Jews. So I think it must have been there, it's just we're now discovering it. But it's not a black and white issue. I think it has it's injected a poison into public life,
and
which
it happens
is pretty vile.
Really, really very poisonous. And of course the other problem is that because of the way social media works and because there's no human interaction, there's no physical interaction, your normal boundaries of how you behave come down. Because
so I would say to that, I mean, we talked about populism, we mentioned it. And in so far as it has a meaning to me, it's really a technique, it's a way of communication, it's a way of, if you like, people would say manipulating public opinion. And clearly social media, the internet, has a huge part to play in new populism. I mean, all sorts of people have been described as populists in the current age, and generally, from Momentum to Trump to Macron, they've been very effective at using new media. And what I would say about to what Stephen said, I think it's a bit naive to think that somehow the internet came and then people started having all these bad thoughts about race or about gender. I think what the internet did was just facilitate people's expressing those views, and they could link up with other people who had those views. So they were validated.
But it does feed. It makes it worse in a way. I mean, people might have had those thoughts. Sorry, I'm interrupting.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I mean, Bill Gates said, the thing about the internet is that it basically can publish every single thought that a human being or human beings have ever had, can just simply, be transmitted in a way that was not possible even 20 years ago.
I think it's very interesting that it's hollowed out the centre. It's hollowed out the centre ground of on social media largely. I mean, you can post things, of course, in the centre ground, but you don't get half as much pickup as you do.
Well, that's because social media works on people saying controversial things that then piss people off and then they share it. So if you say really nice, sensible things like "I really like flowers," no one's going to retweet it.
It's not interesting.
But I'm just about to say, sorry, I thought Ben might have a view of this from his previous life, what he does now. I thought I'd go for supreme popularity this week. I interviewed both Hillary Clinton and then I wrote a piece really slagging off Momentum. And so now I've got half of my Twitter telling me that I'm a sort of patsy of the Hillary Clinton campaign from the American right and sympathiser. And I've got the other lot, I've got friends of Jeremy telling me that I'm kind of evil and sort of you must be an extreme right-winger to write this. I thought, you should meet some of my friends. I mean, and the bit that's gone down the middle, and there are two little examples, everyone, will have their own areas of expertise, but the bit that goes down the middle is anyone actually just reading what you wrote, said, argued, and saying, she might have a point about this, she's totally wrong about that. That bit goes in social media, I'm afraid. We haven't yet found the way to deal with that. I suspect somehow, and then people may have views on what follows, what leads, politics is going a little bit in the same direction.
Yes.
But I think it also, and Michael, you talked about the sort of collapse in trust in elites, and you've seen that quite clearly with the way in which extreme or perceived extreme views have been able to communicate very effectively on social media, and elite mainstream views have struggled. This has also come at a unique time, partly as a consequence of social media, in a shrinking of national media from the BBC to mainstream newspapers and many others. And what that means, I think, is that elite opinion, which, whether you like it or not, has an important role in maintaining stability and guiding the country, really struggles because it struggles to break through. And I thought, I know we're not here to talk about Brexit, but one more stat.
No, we are here. So
And I
it's
wasn't-
fine. It says on the piece
Get
of
over
paper,
it.
Just to slightly correct what Stephen was saying, I wasn't sneeringly in contempt.
I wasn't
of
having a
people
go at you,
Okay, fine.
it was just
I would
generally.
have run the whole Brexit thing differently.
Yeah.
I would have had a proper renegotiation. But anyway, I'm not here to talk about that. What was interesting about some of the analysis from how voters responded during the Brexit campaign was that if you look at how, when asked, did this politician make you vote Leave or Remain? Not surprisingly, Michael encouraged more people to vote Leave than Remain. So did Boris Johnson. So did Nigel Farage. But when asked, how did David Cameron encourage you to vote? Did he encourage you to vote Leave or Remain? More people say that he encouraged them to vote Leave.
Yeah, sure.
He was the head of the Remain campaign. Barack Obama was the silver bullet that was going to resolve the whole problem and put it to bed, and we could all sleep easily. More people say Barack Obama encouraged them to vote Leave, not Remain. So if you try to understand the impact of a collapse in trust in the elites, it comes down to simple, very simple bits of data.
Yes.
Can I just say, I mean, that was true. I mean, the thing in my constituency which swung very heavily for Leave in the end, it was 60%, 40%. But the one thing that really did badly for Remain was the budget, was the emergency budget, which was dubbed and I was going down roads the day before, and they were kind of in the balance. And then as soon as the punishment budget landed, a whole swathe of people said they were going to vote out. So that was, I think, an effect in terms of what you're saying, bears that out. But in terms of the numbers, I mean, as a constituency MP, I mean, my borough was a district in the Leave vote. I got 28,000 votes this year, but 34,000 voted to Leave. So, I mean, obviously, the 34,000 aren't all idiots because most of them voted for me, but there were far many more that voted Leave. And actually, I've asked the same thing about the last thing I'd say about there was a real sort of mismatch, I think, between representation and actually some of the views on this issue. So in the Conservative Party, every MP in Suffolk is a Conservative, or was before. I mean, Ipswich has gone to Labour, but before the 2017 election, every MP in that county was Conservative. All the Conservative MPs were for Remain, yet all the districts, the whole county, district by district, voted out. And I remember pointing this out and saying, there's a mismatch here, which probably isn't very healthy because it's a pretty key issue.
Yeah. Michael, do you think that what do you think the Tory party can now do? I mean, obviously, the tactics that Labour are currently deploying, they're feeding very well off the sort of social media thing. Do you think the Tories will go down that path, or do you think they will...
Well, there are 101 things to do to improve communication, but I think the most important thing is we're in government, so we can actually change perceptions of ourselves, not by positioning, but by policy. So, there are opportunities at budgets or when the attention is on us. I remember Kenneth Baker saying to me before the 2010 general election that he was confident the Conservatives would win and that we would be in power. And he said that the key thing is that, of course, in government there are all sorts of pressures and frustrations, but you deal the cards. And I think that this message was reinforced to me by Malcolm Turnbull, who, of course, leads a minority government in Australia. And he said the thing you must show is that you are commanding the agenda, and that means that even when there is a temptation to be hyper-cautious, actually what you need to do is to show that whatever the set of issues, that you have petrol in your engine. And I think that there are lots and lots of things, but I won't preempt what I or my colleagues are going to announce in the next few weeks.
Do you think, Michael, that your party conference put more petrol in the engine, or do you think it was a bit of a maybe
That's
diesel?
a very
rather than
mean
four-star?
question. And
I think it was
I
think it was a hybrid, and we were
A hybrid vehicle, absolutely.
which is a good thing for environmental reasons.
Yes, well, I mean, if I was in charge, I would abolish party conference. I think it's awful, and it never does. No good ever comes out of party conference.
I'm sure the Prime Minister would agree with you.
In my view. So in terms of how we deal with Europe, just to talk a little bit about Brexit, because it does say Brexit on the leaflet. Do we think that what do we think needs to happen? What do you think needs to happen?
In more
You look like you might know an answer.
In more
to that
specific-
You sort it out.
Well, in terms of, how the sort of interaction seems to be going. Doesn't seem to be going awfully well at the moment.
Well, I've not been privy to the negotiations, which is why one of the things that frustrates me about my own trade is that we pontificate about the ins and outs of something that we really don't have a clue about. We get leaks and briefings and so on. But clearly, I'm not disagreeing with you. It doesn't appear to be going brilliantly. I was listening to Michael in the previous session, and one of the things that frustrates me, that Michael was elaborating on as well, is this slightly false construct between a hard and a soft Brexit. As far as I'm concerned, as a Brexiteer, there's only one thing that really counts for me. The reason that I changed my mind a few years ago when I was working in Brussels, that we had to get out, was the idea of control. As far as I'm concerned, all that matters is, in the end, are the British people able to get rid of the people who take the decisions that govern their lives. It's the old Tony Benn formulation. For me, that's really the only thing that counts. And whether there's a 2-year, 3-year transition period, I'm very relaxed about all of that, as long as I can see the light at the end of the tunnel. And I'll take a view when we get there as to whether that's the case.
Do you think, and if so, why? Do you think that that Brussels are pushing back against us leaving?
Of course they are.
But why are they doing it?
But
if we're saying, we're a democracy, we voted to leave, why are they so resistant to change?
Like any bureaucracy, like any organisation, they want to protect themselves. And I mean, the fact is, one of the biggest contributors to the EU is leaving, and that's putting them in, to put it mildly, a tough spot. So they are, of course, trying to get as much out of us as they possibly can. That's a negotiation. I mean, the interesting dynamic to me, the most interesting dynamic, will come presumably imminently, which is whether the governments are able to change the brief that Barnier has got. Because Barnier is operating on a particular brief that is designed for the European Commission, and presumably, I would hope, although I don't know whether this is actually happening, that our government and others are pressing properly to the governments of the European Union, rather than to the European Union itself, that a deal needs to be done in their interests, rather than the interests of the EU as an institution.
Yes, I mean, sorry,
yes, I would emphasise Berlin over Brussels, possibly because I spent a lot of time in Germany and dealing with the German government on these issues. I think Brussels, we take it very seriously here, and it's also, they make a lot of noise, and we sort of gratify them by reporting that noise and perhaps amplifying it. I think what Angela Merkel thinks, albeit from a slightly weakened position in Berlin, is probably more important than what people believe in Brussels, because she can, if she wants a deal by the end of this year or the first quarter of next, which I still believe to be possible if the government here just stops trying to shoot its own foot off every few weeks, it is a possible deal to do, at least a transitional deal that would establish the direction of travel. And I mean, we don't give away table talk here, but someone associated with Clifton said to me last night, in the end, I don't mind, but can you just tell me what is the context in which I would be doing business here in 2 or 3 years' time? And I do believe that Berlin, despite the bad mood, can be worked around. Unfortunately, I think the perception that the Prime Minister here herself is trying to balance too many things rather than saying clearly what she thinks the direction of travel should be. I mean, I've got lost and I deal with it every day. I mean, is it we want a long transition? Is it we want a short transition? Is it hard or soft Brexit? Do these terms not mean anything? Because she says they don't, but everybody else thinks they do. Then Philip Hammond says, oh, it'll all be awful if we do it now. And then hashtag let's get out quickly in the cabinet. Possibly my neighbour, I don't know, says, oh no, you can't hold this back because the people expect it to have happened. Well, no wonder people are confused abroad, because they're bloody confused here.
Well, I think, but looking back, clearly Article 50 should not have been in vote right after the referendum, even though it was in vote, in fact, 9 months after. We should have spent a considerable period of time actually thinking what Brexit meant and how we were going to execute it, and we didn't, number one. Number two, the Commission and the Council, so the Commission of the bureaucracy, the Council of the 27 members, they've handled things completely as you would expect. They've sought to try and secure the toughest possible deal for the Brits, which is fair enough. And we have misunderstood the way in which the mandate is established. 27 prime ministers or heads of government put their names to a mandate, sent Barnier into a negotiating room. And not surprisingly, Theresa May and David Davis keep saying, well, guys, can't you change your mind? And Mr. Barnier says, well, I'm very sorry, I can't. I've got 27 heads of government to respond to. And so that fundamental misunderstanding as to how this negotiation was going to play out between 1 and 27 means that we're now sort of stuck in this kind of traffic jam, and I've got no idea how they're going to resolve it, because clearly the Brits should be taking a different view, and there's obviously no political space for them to do that.
Okay, so a couple of things there. I mean, I think to expect that Berlin is going to come in on a white knight, so to speak, and save the day, I think is unrealistic, because you see what happened in the German election. She spent 2 weeks negotiating with the CSU, which is meant to be her sister party. So ahead of that election, we thought Angela Merkel would secure a big mandate. On the day of the election itself, everyone thought she's got a 4th term. But then when you actually looked at the numbers and you looked in the weeds, you found that she's actually in quite a weak position. So that's one thing that I would.
Chancellor.
She's still the Chancellor, but she hasn't formed a government, and she'll have to negotiate. And as I understood, I found out from German politicians this week that any coalition agreement that the FDP sign up to, they will revert to their members, and the Greens as well. So there are difficulties there. The other thing I would say is that, I mean, perhaps I'm a little cynical, but it was always going to be like this. There was always going to be, at the beginning of a negotiation, a standoff, drama, tears. Oh, you don't know what you're doing. That's what happens in politics. That's what happens in a negotiation. And speaking with a sort of very small Treasury hat on, I've got a role as the Parliamentary Private Secretary. The Treasury, Philip Hammond, is very confident that a deal will be reached. And I share that confidence. I think there'll be a roller coaster. There'll be times when a deal seems extremely far away. But I'm very confident that at the end of the process, we will get a deal. I don't think we're going to crash out. I don't think it's going to be a cliff edge or any of the things that have been mentioned. I think the transition period, as Stephen Pollard mentioned, completely makes sense. We were in it for 46 years. We can live with another 2 years of transition. And I think most Brexiteers are, if not happy, are reconciled to that. And I think, there's a great positive story out there. And we can beat ourselves and say how miserable it is and how we don't understand anything and how complicated it is. But generally, if you look at it broadly, we're a sixth of the EU GDP, and it is both in our mutual interest to get a deal. And I think reason in that form will prevail. I don't think we're going to crash out. I don't think the skies are going to fall in. Cliveden will still be Cliveden. Michael will still probably be in the government.
The aeroplanes are not going to be grounded.
The aeroplanes are not going to be grounded.
The aeroplanes are not being grounded.
And I think we've got to get a bit of perspective here.
Yes, Michael.
Yes, there's a book in America called The Rules, which tells you how to date. I've never read it. But,
did you know that? Can you give us that?
But I understand that one of the principles in it is the importance of playing hard to get. But of course you have to balance it, because if you play hard to get, and then the other person grows exasperated, they might just walk away and you've lost that opportunity. What you were trying to do was to lure them in, and in fact your facade of indifference to their attentions only pushes them away.
I'm glad that my husband is so in favour of these things.
Yes. And I think Ben is as ever right. The negotiating mandate that Michel Barnier has was one that was agreed to by the 27, because this was something that they could agree to. They could all agree to, let's get the maximum amount of cash out, because either we're a contributor or a beneficiary. Let's make sure that our citizens over there are protected. Oh, in the Irish border, that's in the land borders, so we've got to sort that out. And at the moment, it's in Michel Barnier's interests to say, we're waiting. Sorry, we need a bit more cash in order to try to get the UK side to sweat. But there will come a point, not where people walk out, but there will come a point where the EU 27 recognise that unless they say, all right, sufficient progress has been reached, then there is the risk of no deal, and the risk of no deal hits both sides. One other thing as well, one of the reasons why there's no pressure on Barnier at the moment, or the pressure has been less than it might otherwise have been, is that once you do move to the stage where the EU 27 are involved in negotiating a trade deal, then you see the differences, and not splits, not divisions, but the difference of emphasis between the EU 27. So they can all agree on the first three. There'll be some, what's the word? I think that for the sake of argument, Emmanuel Macron and Viktor Orban will take a slightly different view about the future relationship that they might want to have with the UK.
Do you think that Brussels are just secretly hoping that Theresa May will go and we'll get a nice Remainer who will make it not happen?
No, I think that I think there was a period during which some European politicians thought, this is way before the general election, that we didn't really mean it, and that this was a negotiating feint and that a bit like the Dutch and the Irish and indeed the French, we would have another referendum in order to reverse the first one. And then the centime dropped, and that wasn't going to happen.
It's the euro now.
It is exactly.
Keep up. It is the euro. It's the cent. Oh my goodness.
We've unbelievably spoken for 45 minutes. I wonder whether people, do you want to ask questions? Shall we open the floor up? Yes, yeah. Ladies, the lady there. Would you like to stand up so we can all see you?
I'm American. So obviously I'm not an expert on England or Europe. But one thing I observed, many of people in America did, was that when Brexit won, we realized that Trump might be elected. Yeah. And what I observed is that both campaigns relied on two things: pushing the buttons of fear and untruths about what was going to happen, and that people who are very fearful, and I believe, and I could be wrong, that it's as a result of growing inequality in income. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Kwasi?
Yeah, I mean, I think the meme, and this is where I'm not a Marxist, or less of a Marxist than Michael, you'll be pleased to know, is that there was this narrative that was very quickly established that it was about the left behinds. And that the BBC just went on and on and on about that, the Labour voters. But actually, if you looked at the bare numbers, the average Brexit voter was just as likely to be a kind of middle-class retired colonel type in Wiltshire or Hampshire or Kent than he or she was likely to be a Labour voter. So what I'm explaining here.
Wasn't there a fear of immigrants?
There was all of that, but there was also, and nobody has mentioned it at all here, and it never ever gets mentioned, there was also a nationalism. And I mean it in a neutral way. I don't mean it in a negative Adolf Hitler marching up and down, in Berlin. I mean it in a British exceptionalism way. There was a sense in which, as Stephen alluded to, people wanted to take back control in whatever way they felt, and they felt that Britain is a different country. Now you might think that's laughable, but they did believe that, and if you go to my constituency and go to the pub and talk to some of these people, they did believe in their institutions. They did believe that Britain had a unique history. They looked at the continent of Europe, and no one ever mentions this, but they look at the fact that in the four of the major countries, you'd had dictatorships in living memory: Hitler, Mussolini, Franco, and Vichy France. They looked at the kernels, they looked at the political instability, and they said, actually, what we have is different, and we want to pursue our own course. And many of those voters, who were conservative voters, also were prepared to take the economic hit. I mean, I was struck by the number of people who were saying...
Well, I mean, they were told they would lose £2,000 per person. No one seemed to care.
Well, some did, but they thought, well, this is the price we're going to pay for an independent country. And my background is from Ghana, so I know all about the independent struggles. And exactly the same arguments were being made in independence. You're going to be much better off under the British Empire than you possibly would be if you were an independent country. And you know what? The people said we'd rather be independent. So economics doesn't rule everything. And that's what I wanted to say. Economics is very, very important, very powerful. But the attempt to reduce everything to economics, I think, was one of the big failures of the Remain campaign.
Michael, you wanted to say something?
Yes, Kwasi made the argument that I was going to make with reference to Ghana. I was going to say, between 1776 and 1783, there were a group of people in the United States of America who were running a campaign on the basis that they wanted democratic institutions. They didn't want to be part of a larger condominium, which theoretically made them wealthier, but actually deprived them of liberty. And during the course of that campaign and afterwards, you had people like Hamilton and Jefferson, and Burr and Washington, vigorously debating what should happen in that state. And if we'd had I don't want to be unfair to The Economist or the FT or any of these papers, but if you'd had particular types of newspapers at the time, then it would have been the case that King George III's Project Fear would have been criticised by some, and then the extravagant promises of Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson would have been criticised by others, and then it would have been the case that the Jefferson-Hamilton cabinet battles and discussions would have been depicted as George Washington paralysed as Jefferson takes one view and Hamilton another, and the 200 years following on from that weren't so bad for America or for the world. So.
I just want to say something. I want to briefly say that fear was on both sides because, we were all told the world was going to end. So, it was not just one side. And you wanted to say...
that's a collapsible history tent that you just built there. It would have been good if a lot of those questions you'd been asked along the way about the American Revolution and everything else. So I have no apologies for, papers that you don't like all their conclusions on Brexit, pressing you to say what is going to be better about it and how are we going to, when would we know? Thanks very much. But I do have a question for you, Michael, and it comes out of the previous debate, which was fascinating, between you and James Harding. I mean, it's a very easy trope now to sort of go for the Economist or the FT. In fact, there's variation, I would suggest, within them as well. Do you think that the BBC has been fair
and
about
stop
Brexit?
interviewing my husband.
Do I think the BBC has been fair?
Right?
No, you can't interview. Because we need to move on.
Right, okay. Can we have an answer then, just quickly?
Yes.
Yes,
Right,
that
you think it's
was
been
an
fair?
answer.
Okay, good.
Go on then.
Hi, can the panel gaze into a crystal ball for a moment and tell us what the status is? It's the end of March 2021.
Oh, good Lord. I think I'll be in my grave by then if it carries on like this. Lucy.
I think that Jeremy Corbyn will probably, by 2021, I think Corbyn will probably be Prime Minister by then. I think we will have certainly left the European Union or be leaving. And Spurs will have won the league.
Stephen.
I agree with Ben on two of those things. The third that I don't think Corbyn will be Prime Minister by then. I think there'll be a different Conservative as Prime Minister then, who is, I would guess, but given that I began this by saying I know absolutely nothing about politics, obviously, from my useless predictions of the election, but I would imagine it would be somebody who's not amongst the names that are continually being touted around now. It will be somebody from a much younger generation.
It's going to be Kwasi,
I hope. Kwasi, yes.
What do you think, Kwasi?
I think that Spurs are more likely to win the league than Jeremy Corbyn are going to be. And those are pretty remote
by me.
contingencies. I don't think Corbyn will be Prime Minister by that point. And actually, I think the world... I mean, one of the things that I don't want to do is engage in a kind of theological debate about the perfect state of post-Brexit Britain and the perfect state of if we'd stayed in the EU. I mean, I think what happens when things like this happen is that there's a gradual divergence. So it'll be a lot clearer, the relationship that we have in 10 years' time or in 2030 than would be the case in April 2021. And as a Brexiteer, I wanted to have that divergence. The reason why I was a Brexit person was that the internal dynamic of the euro, to me, meant there has to be integration. I really feel that very strongly. I think and if you listen to Macron, he talks about the common finance minister, they have to deal with some sort of banking union and also have fiscal oversight. I think the logic of that meant that the periphery would be sort of pushed away if you weren't part of the single currency. And that was really the sole reason why I went for Brexit, because I could see closer integration. I think there will be closer integration by 2021 in Europe. And I think hopefully we can have a free trade arrangement with that entity. But I think there will be divergence between what we call Europe or the EU and Britain. And the last thing I would say is that once you take Britain out of the EU, 90% of the EU's GDP today is Eurozone. And the Eurozone was always designed as a currency for the EU. And I think that will work itself out.
Anne?
Well, I'm not sure whether Corbyn will be Prime Minister. I think there's a high chance, but probably I wouldn't emphasise it as much as we heard the other end of the panel. I think it can be held off. Remember, he came under very, very little scrutiny for his views. It was a mess of a campaign from the Tory side. But I think people are beginning to wake up that there's something else that they need to be aware of if they want to go into it. It depends also whether they really do deliver all those young voters the next time. Can be held off. I'm very sure Theresa May won't be Prime Minister by 2021. I think the EU, also the strains in the Eurozone, will have manifested themselves again. It's a reasonably good period in the Eurozone at the moment. That's one reason our currency is down, but it's also, I think, it's not something that is resolved. There's a lot of banking. Angela Merkel, whoever takes over Angela Merkel, also the largest economy banking, strongly on it working out with Macron. He's an impressive character, but he is not tested, and I think the strains in the Eurozone could look very trying indeed by 2021. I think we will be out of the EU, but there's a little bit of me that thinks of the Hotel California, you check out any time you like, but you can never leave. And I suspect that we might still, dreams of the Brexiteers around me notwithstanding, be tracking rather more closely, trying to get the best out of that relationship with the EU. I rather hope that's the way it works out. I don't think the EU will be without its problems either.
It's a very good question, by the way. What do you think?
I once wrote a book called Michael Portillo, The Future of the Right. So that should disbar me from making any political predictions at all whatsoever.
Can I just say I have a lot of old stock, if any of you want to.
And I also once wrote a column at the time that the Liberal Democrats were having one of their leadership elections, the one from which Charles Kennedy emerged as leader. And I said then that the person I thought would be leader of the Liberal Democrats was a person called Jackie Ballard. And if anyone here can recall who Jackie was and which seat she represented, then there's a job for you in the Conservative Research Fund. No, but the fun thing I just want to say about predictions is there's a marvellous American academic called Philip Tetlock who's written about political predictions. And the point he's made is that the people worst at predicting the political future are pundits. Because pundits feel that they have to, having made a prediction, sift all the evidence which is uncomfortable for them and ignore it, look for all the evidence that backs them up and push that for their readers. And there is something called confirmation bias, which also afflicts all of us, but particularly affects pundits. And Tetlock looked at political predictions made by media pundits and compared them to completely random guesses. And at the end, he discovered, literally, that a blindfold chimp throwing darts at a dartboard was more likely to accurately predict political events than newspaper columnists. And I speak as a newspaper columnist myself.
Any more questions? Questions? Radek. Radek, you had a question. It's burning, I can see inside of you.
I just wanted to put to rest one of the questions, which is one thing is certain. In March 2019, Britain will cease to be a member of the European Union. You've sent your resignation letter, and that's it. And nobody can stop you. But I just want to make you aware of the fact how astonished people on the continent are when people in Britain talk about leaving the EU as a piece of liberation from the Brussels yoke. Because like our MP, I was also born in a country that wasn't free, and I remember what it really feels like, for demanding a referendum on Poland's membership in the Warsaw Pact, you would have been put in jail. That's what not being independent means. Yeah. You voluntarily applied to the European Union. You were rejected. You applied again, and you went through a succession of voluntary treaties. Mm-hmm. That's not a yoke.
I've never used it.
And if you wanted to resign from the European Union, you don't even need to wait until March 2019. You can do it today. You just stop sending the monthly wire transfer, you stop sending the ministers to Brussels, and you declare no longer respecting the judgments of the ECG. You are out, and I assure you there will be no Luftwaffe over Clifton.
Yes.
Okay, and that's the no deal breakout, and you would be free. And one only other thing that I would say is that when you describe the deal, you have to tell us on the continent what you want. Because there are basically three models of relationship of a third country, which you will be with us. Members of the customs union, members of the single market, outside the customs union, and everything else will be technicalities. But until the British government tells Europe what it wants, we are not going to have a successful negotiation.
Okay, thank you, Radek. What is your question? Was there a question?
Minister, what do you want?
Thank you.
I want you on the negotiating team for Britain, Radek.
Yes! Will you do it? Yes.
Can you just tell my three adult children who all voted for Remain why they just don't get it? They really think that you have sold their future down the river, and they will have their revenge. I mean, you know, who do they vote for? Corbyn, really? That's who they're going to turn to. That's going to happen.
Can I just answer that, just to reassure them? Because I completely agree with Kwasi that it's perfectly clear that as the European Union moves essentially into the Eurozone and everyone else, that if Britain was not going to join the Eurozone, and I think not going to have the Euro, and I think it's pretty clear that we never were, or certainly not in my lifetime, that probably this relationship between periphery and core was where we were going to end up. The question is, how do you get there? And you probably don't get there by doing it in the way that we're doing it at the moment. You get it through a much longer process of trying to understand the Eurozone and everyone else, and we're everyone else, and therefore we have these rights. And the notion of building this kind of political construct that we've seen since the war has probably come to an end with Brexit. And so what I would say to your kids is, I voted Remain, I would say that I'm sorry that we're heading in the way that we're going, but to reassure them, it was probably always ultimately going to end up like this. And I think that over the course of the next 20, 30 years, the relationship between the periphery and the core will be where we end up. And I'm sure that Britain will be able to establish a perfectly good relationship alongside Ukraine and Turkey and a few others, where we exist perfectly happily, recognising that we were never going to have the euro, but we need to continue to have as close a possible relationship with the European Union.
Can I ask the lady who asked the question, do they have specific concerns?
Yes, because they feel European. You know, they feel that sort of, it's a mixture of lies, racism, you know, the immigration thing. They don't understand it. Younger
what are they
people
specifically worried about? Not being able to go to Europe, not being able to work in Europe?
Well, it's a variety of things, really.
Right.
I mean, a lot of it, as you know, was said in the campaign about fear, particularly, I think, on the Leave side, about, you know, what's going to happen. I'm sorry that they.
In terms of specifics, I agreed completely with Ben. I just had a different view in the campaign in terms of how we were going to get there. I think we would. I mean, you mentioned the referendum. I actually thought we were going to leave the EU probably in the 2020s. That's what I thought. Because of this.
Well, no, the EU was going to leave us. That's
Yeah,
the whole point.
The Eurozone, however you put it, I thought.
I think that's an important distinction.
Okay, so, and I've said this. I think I've probably written it. In 20 years' time, I think historians looking back at this period will say the fact that we did not join the euro was the most significant fact. Was more significant in many ways than Brexit, because I think if we had joined the euro, the whole we wouldn't have had Brexit, and I think the whole dynamic would have changed. Not joining the euro, I think, led to the thing you very eloquently described. And as a consequence of that, I think our paths are going to slowly diverge. Now, for me, I don't think we need to have a cast iron description of exactly what it's going to look like in 4 years' time once the transition period is over. And actually, I loved Michael's analogy of the American War of Independence. Because even though it seemed flippant, there was a kernel of truth in that. In that these people had been in part of a system for 150 years. That's always forgotten. But they'd been part of the system for 150 years, and they went to another state which had never happened before, and they took that risk. So I completely see that we don't have to have a completely ironclad description of where we will be at the end of the process, but there will be a divergence, and that will continue.
But you have so much uncertainty. That's another thing.
But what he's saying is there would have been uncertainty anyway, because we would have been in a similar situation. I mean, I think that people get very emotional about the whole Brexit thing. And I think our panel have made some good arguments as to why it's not just an emotional issue. But I understand that. Sorry, there was a lady over there who had... No, a gentleman, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Richard Dold from Somerset and France. About 20 years ago, we had a lord come and speak to a local conservative society in Somerset, and his job had been as a sort of envoy to go to Brussels every week or two and go and sign the latest directive from the European Union. He'd be presented with a pile of papers and asked to sign it. And if he squibbled and said, well, I'm not sure, and I don't know whether my colleagues are fully au fait with this, Well, if you don't sign it, you're not being a good European. And this has carried on for 40 years, I think. Well, he was just one of them. And it seemed as if there were very few dissenters for 40 years as to what was happening. One of the few was David Heathcote Amory, our erstwhile MP, but there were not very many. And it seems to be extraordinary that we've sleepwalked all the way through for 40 years with all these things happening to the country, and suddenly now everybody's up in arms.
Well, I mean, we've never had a referendum on it.
I know, but nobody's really protested. Now they want to know, just about everybody wants to know chapter and verse what the blueprint's going to be for this next week's negotiations. What are they going to say? Can we have a transcript, please, of everything in advance? And yet, it's not happened for the past 4 decades.
It's transparency.
I think it's extraordinary. You know, the contrast between the two, and I just wonder if the panel have an opinion on that. Thank you.
Michael?
Gosh, what should I say? No, I absolutely take your point about the impatient desire that people have for constant updates about the progress of negotiations, which, as everyone has mentioned here, are unlikely to proceed at quite the pace that either the news media or an anxious set of, the commentariat would want. But I think that relates to one of the earlier conversations that we had about the changing nature of the media. And it's not a criticism of any title, but just part of the fabric of our time.
Yeah, yes. Transparency, all that stuff. Any more questions? Oh, lots. Person very at the back, please.
Yes, I'm Joe Public. And I was born when the Prime Minister in Downing Street was Stanley Baldwin. So I have a long experience of government. Now, government to me was the responsibility for the well-being of the whole country, not to turn it over by a badly run referendum, because you, the government, Mr. Gove, have a responsibility to know about Europe, and you also have the means to know about Europe.
I'm sorry, sir, can I just interrupt you? What is your question?
My question is that all of you have not done your job, and I wish you'd get on with it and get on with Parliament to sort us out of this terrible mess.
Okay, thank you. What about the lady at the back?
Hi. I'm a mother, I have a 17-year-old next to me, but my question is this. I was very privileged, went to a private school in Rome, an international school. I was the only English child in my class amongst every other European country and other world war country pretty much that could have been. Any playtime, you would have seen us all playing very happily together, but there were rules that guided all our behaviour. Now, obviously, we still have friends and contacts, and I'm really struggling to explain to them why I'm not a European. I'm English, Scottish, Welsh in my blood. I was born here. But could you please explain to me why I am not European? Because I'm not sure I get it. Because that's what appears to be driving the political decisions,
you are European.
financial.
You live in the continent.
But you're
of
removing
Europe.
me from Europe.
No, I think this is a real nominalist fallacy.
Yes.
The EU is not Europe.
Different things.
They are different. The EU is a political institution.
But if we're going to
Europe is
and
a
an economic,
geographical
exactly.
continent.
I mean, I grew up in Italy. I went to school with Italians. I was the only English girl in the class. I learned to speak Italian because I didn't have any other choice. I got on very well with Italians. I get on very well with English. It's not about that. It's really just not about that at all. So this notion that it's about, oh, we don't like Italians, we don't like the French people, whatever, nothing to do with it. It's nothing to do with that. It's we don't. People. Sorry, not when I say we. I say people who voted to leave. It's a union of politicians and an economic arrangement. That's all it is. It's nothing else.
But I'm sorry, how do we play and work alongside each other if we're not all within the same system?
You can do that, yes. It's very easy for me to work alongside an American. I don't have to be a part of the United States of America to have an American colleague, do I?
Could I throw Norway and Switzerland at you, and perhaps also countries who are trying to join the EU in what I call Central Europe, some people call Eastern Europe, who who are European. But I mean, I think the question
I'm
is
just
what the lady says.
We did actually only join the EU in 1973.
Yes. And before, I mean,
so people were living in Europe, people were working in Europe, people were being educated in Europe, people had relationships with Europeans before we were a member of a political construct, and it's not going to stop when we leave a political construct.
No. But I mean, Stephen is Jewish, and I'm Christian, and I can work with him. It's fine.
Up to a point.
So but the European colleagues working with my husband are going to have to go home. He's losing.
Do you want us to go? Oh, sorry, we've got to stop now. They won't have to go home. There will be an arrangement. There will be an agreement. There will be some kind of, won't there? There'll be some sort of arrangement.
Is the chair impartial?
No, I'm not. I just think that they're being irrational.
I find it very depressing that people think that the EU and Europe are synonymous. And clearly a lot of people do think that. And I just don't think that's right. I think the reason why we left the EU was because a lot of us didn't want to be part of that political construct. It's an artificial, in the strict sense, construct.